Individual liberty is likely to lead to increased wealth in a body politic. But what about the economic status or the socioeconomic status of those living in that country? In Dickovic and Eastwood's book, Comparing Politics, Integrating Theories, Methods, and Cases, he states that everything's a theory. You have hypotheses, and you have to prove your point. He also makes the claim that wealthier countries are likelier to be democratic than poor countries. Can make sense, right? But this does not mean that every rich country will be a democracy and every low-income country will be under authoritarian rule. This is more or less him stating studies have shown that wealthier countries are under democratic rule because their people have free choice. They have free market. They are able to make their choices and not have to be told, you are going to be an artisan. You are going to work in the agricultural field. They're not forced to do something that's not their calling. In a democratic society, you're allowed to choose how much education you have. And usually your education is based, your income is based on your education. If you allow for someone to say, no, you're not going to do this, or you allow the government to rule what you say, as in a dictatorship or a totalitarian government, you need total control of the government, the income is not going to be as much. But he also states that that's not every single case. Okay, so as you can see in this graphic in Dickovic and Eastwood's book, they show the per capita, the GDP per capita on the top, and the green is the highest, whereas the purple, like in Africa, is the lowest. And he also shows how, the GDP per capita, it comes about. But then if you look at the bottom, it also shows democracy in certain countries in 2015. So let's take a look. We have green in the USA. We have the over 400% GDP per capita, but we also are a free country. And it shows that, Russia's in the second tier. Here, see, Russia's in the second tier. But they're also not a free country. But one that really stands out, you see Mongolia, right there above China. Mongolia, right there. It's in one of the lowest per capitas, GDP per capitas, but it's also a free country. So there, his theory, Dickovic and Eastwood's theory, that not every single country that is free, or excuse me, not every single rich country is democratic. But not every low income is under authoritarian rule. And that graphic shows that Mongolia has one of the lowest GDPs per capita, but they're a free country. They have democracy. So he has proved his theory, his hypothesis, on wealth and democracy. Let's look at an example of something real fast. So in Glenn Martin's Prevailing Worldviews of Western Society since 1500, he states that the first 4 words of the Bible are without question the most instructive of the words of God to man. In the beginning, God, which means God is in charge of everything in our lives. It doesn't matter what we're doing, what we're up against. God is in charge of everything we do and everything that we think. Martin goes on to explain different types of God allowing men to make some choices, but ultimately he's in charge. He's going to tell you what's going on. Okay, so he talks about what's called the Holy Commonwealth, or the covenantal arrangement. God is over all of life and is reaching down to relate with man in all of his affairs, individual and institutional. So God is a part of everything we do in life, whether it be our personal life, our political life, whether it is any type of affair, institutional, anything we do, God is in charge of our lives. The recognition that God is over all of life, no area accepted, and the sovereignty of God institutionalized. So if you believe in God, you have to believe the fact that He is going to take care of you. He is in charge of everything you do in everyday lives. So he shows this little graphic here, and it says God, and it says law. Let me make sure I got it. School, church, civil, social, arts, economics, international relations. Okay, so he's saying that this is a big deal. God is in charge of everything we do. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. He ultimately has the ultimate say. So kind of like a totalitarian government. But we actually have freedom within our lives. Okay, so let's look at a more recent example, or something that's more known to everybody. So the French Revolution. Everybody knows the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte and his wife Marie Antoinette and the entire people that ran France, they, ran it pretty much into the ground, and the people were starving in the streets, etc. But let's look at what Howard Brown in his article Napoleon Bonaparte Political Prodigy states. Okay, so Napoleon was able to assume power on the basis of new forms of political legitimacy because he represented a viable alternative to both the failure of democratic politics and the return of cooperative absolutism. Okay, so democracy has failed in France. Not today, but during Napoleon Bonaparte times. Democracy fails. So does absolutism. So he has got to assume power and do something that he can possibly do. He goes on to say, a directorial regime that made great strides in strengthening the power of the central state. In this sense, it was fashioning a clear expression of distinguishing political power from social power. Power in society was to be exercised by those who held office, whether they were elected or appointed, not those who had merely inherited titles or wealth. Although the Directory clearly strengthened state power, it did not do so from a position at the center of the political spectrum. So now we're left with Napoleon Bonaparte has come in and he's saying, these people are either appointed or they're elected. You're not going to just rule the country or this area because you inherited the title and the wealth. But where does the wealth go? So we're starting to see that not every country can function under democratic society. Today, France, well, they have a very similar democratic society. But we start to see that things are starting to fall apart. It's a great idea on paper, but it starts to fall apart. Let's look at another great theory. Let's go back to Dickovic and Eastwood's idea. Theory, communism looks great on paper. Everything works out the way it's supposed to. You have these people, but you have taken away their individual liberty. So communism can't work unless you have pretty much completed lobotomy on your workers. They know nothing but what they're supposed to do. That's not going to work because now you have taken their choice away, their free choice away. In the French Revolution, the government was rich. Napoleon and Marie Antoinette were living on the high life. But the people in the streets who no longer had individual liberty were poor. They were starving. Reminds me when the Civil War broke out. We started having the bread riots in Richmond. They couldn't afford to feed, the Confederate States of America could not afford to feed the citizens of the Confederate States. One, of course, the Union Army blockades around and all that fun stuff. But you start to see when your individual liberty is starting to take away, your wealth goes with it. Now, how about on an individual level? And we can go back to the graphic I showed earlier where 9 times out of 10, the highest GDP per capita correlates with the fact that that country is democracy or they're a free country, except for the case of Mongolia. But you start to see the picture. You start to see that individual liberty likely leads to wealth within the body politic.